I started by carving into the wood of the magic wand. Here, I hollowed out a long, narrow cavity deep inside the shaft. Then, I poured in the liquefied remains of a kidnapped great gremlin. I let the essence solidify right there inside the wood. By embedding 4 gremlins into the core, I managed to cut mana consumption by a staggering 93%. The jewel at the tip amplifies the spell, while the internal etchings reflect the power. I had finally completed the ultimate wand, a structural masterpiece of magical collaboration. Before all this, I drifted from one job to another in the heart of the city. The constant stress of dealing with people eventually broke me. My mind and body gave out, so I fled to the mountains of Okutama. I shut myself away in a secluded rental house where no one could find me. I realized I could survive through online auctions, earning a living without ever having to look another person in the eye. Inside my quiet room, I found my true calling. I'd take junked microwaves, fix them up, and sell them to strangers through a screen. When it came to working with my hands, I was on a different level. I had absolute confidence in my craft. At first, I made decent money just flipping repaired electronics, but the constant anxiety of being outpaced by competitors started to eat at me. I decided to take the next step and become a primary producer myself. I started checking the upcoming previews for new anime releases. I'd study the weapons of popular characters and recreate them in the real world with my own hands. I mastered the art of replicating complex transformation mechanisms. I made sure every detail captured the character's essence perfectly. I even used specific perfumes and materials to evoke their very presence. I gave them a Western-style durability that felt authentic and heavy. My ultra-realistic weapons gained a massive, cult-like following. Passionate fans would snap them up at my buy-it-now prices instantly. As the winning bids rolled in, my bank account began to overflow. I filled my workshop with high-end tools and rare materials, living a life of perfect peace without seeing a soul. It was a fulfilling life, tucked away deep in the heart of the mountains. But one day, during my solitary routine, I stepped out into my backyard and stopped dead in my tracks. I found something that shouldn't have been there. It was a strange meteorite, still radiating a faint, pulsing heat from last night's meteor shower. The stone felt alive, humming with an energy that wasn't from this world. I thought about forging this gift from the stars into something incredible. I wanted to create my very own magical weapon, fueled by a childhood sense of wonder. With my heart racing, I carried that mysterious black stone back into my dim workshop. I carefully shaved away the mixed components on the surface. A jewel-like crystalline core from the heavens revealed itself. I tried scanning it with my specialized equipment and cross-referencing my data. But no matter how much I searched, its true identity remained a mystery. It surpassed the hardness limits of every known substance on Earth. A phantom Mohs scale 11, a cosmic mystery that even outclassed diamond. I let out a cry of shock and pure excitement at this celestial wonder. I needed to know what this unknown material actually was. Just as I went to search for it online, everything suddenly cut out. My PC's power died, and my smartphone followed suit, sinking into a deep, heavy silence inside my workshop. The power supply to all my devices had completely vanished. I wondered if some kind of disaster had happened nearby. With how fast things get fixed in Japan, I figured it'd be back in a few weeks. I tried to mask my faint anxiety with optimism as I sat in the dark. I was deep in the mountains, after all. I could easily continue my solitary, shut-in lifestyle. The most important thing was my food supply. My stockpiles and first aid kits were perfect, even if I couldn't use online auctions. I wasn't exactly hurting for money, even in this silence where not even a flashlight would turn on. I decided to wait for the infrastructure to return while facing this terrifying cosmic jewel. I used steel and chisels to carve the raw stone into a perfect sphere, then ground down the white fragments to create a polishing agent. 3 months passed by in a blur of work. I had become like a hermit, a lone angel of the Okutama Mountains. Finally, I finished polishing the Mohs scale 11 speed light gem. It had a refractive index of 1.55. The spherical jewel radiated a deep, mouse-gray glow that took my breath away. It contained a beauty that was almost terrifying to behold. The mystery of this massive gem, carved from a meteorite, had completely captured my heart and soul. But as the sun rose and set, I realized that 7 days had already slipped past. The electricity and water were still completely cut off. I had enough stockpiled food to survive for the time being. But the delay in restoration efforts reaching Okutama was strange. A faint sense of irritation began to flicker in my chest. Japan's efficient government would surely fix this. They would return my life to normal soon enough. I believed that without a doubt, even as I stared at that piece of the universe. My mother always had a romantic heart. I continued to carve the Okutama meteorite, shaping my very own beautiful magic wand, and waving it around lazily as I worked. I decided to wait for rescue, and another 7 days slipped quietly by. But those peaceful days, spent admiring the beautiful meteorite, were about to be shattered without warning. I had been grinding the fragments down again to pass the time. I began to investigate the natural frequency of the speedlight gem like a curious child, running experiments with whatever tools I had on hand, until I finally found the exact sound wavelength that resonated with the stone. Interesting, I muttered to myself. The stone began to vibrate violently, resonating with the sound of my own voice. I let out a shout of pure excitement, but that was a mistake. That playful shout became the ultimate trigger. In the next instant, a flash of pitch-black light erupted from the stone, blasting through the ceiling of my house with a deafening roar. It all happened so fast. I stared out toward the distant city, looking at the horizon as if I were seeing the impossible. Then, I looked down at my own trembling hands. I had carved this wood from a protective garden tree and embedded the meteorite fragments into the tip. It was supposed to be a toy, a simple cosplay prop. I never dreamed it would actually fire a lethal beam of light, driven by pure impulse. I turned back toward the city skyline, raised the wand high, and let out a roar. The air itself seemed to tear open. As a massive ribbon of light erupted from the tip, it was actually real. My screams of shock and joy echoed through the silent, deep mountains. "This is incredible," I shouted. The thrill of using real magic for the first time surged through me. But the rush was short-lived, and I collapsed instantly. A tragic, crushing wave of exhaustion washed over my body. This wasn't just physical muscle fatigue. I felt weightless, as if I were drifting through the void of space. I felt lightheaded, my mind drifting in a strange, airy haze. This was it, the hollow, drained sensation of running out of mana. It felt like I was being pulled into the depths of deep space. The silence was absolute. My life had officially turned into a fantasy novel. Right then, I made a choice. I would turn this wand into a true weapon of war. 14 days had passed since the electricity and water were cut off. The city's infrastructure had completely collapsed into ruin. Everything was dead silent, but I was the only one who knew the truth of this mystery. I was so obsessed with my internal power that I didn't even care about the world recovering. Another week crawled by, but even after all that time, the power grid didn't show a single sign of life. I've always been someone who loves my solitude, but even I have my limits. I was starving for information about what was happening outside the borders of the city. I remembered an old piece of junk I'd bought for pennies. I reached for my beat-up, secondhand radio, pulling it out and tinkering with the dials like I always did. I set to work, my hands moving instinctively to repair the device. I cracked open the radio's casing to look inside, but what I saw was a sight more bizarre than anything in the city outside. I stared, unable to believe my own eyes. The internal components were stained a milky, pale white. Eerie crystals had grown over every inch of the circuitry, smothering the hardware completely. They hadn't just stuck to the surface, they looked like they had burst out from within. A cold dread washed over me, and I rushed to check my other electronics. Every single appliance in my house was the same. Crystals were sprouting directly from the power units, shattering the machines from the inside out. This wasn't some freak accident limited to my apartment. The realization hit me like a physical blow. The entire electrical grid of the city must look like this. Everything had been systematically consumed by these mysterious crystals. The peaceful, quiet life I thought I was living had suddenly mutated into a waking horror story. If no rescue teams were coming to Okutama, then this phenomenon had likely swallowed all of Japan. No, this meant it was happening on a global scale. Life support systems in hospitals, transportation networks, and communication lines. Human civilization, stripped of its power, was crumbling with terrifying fragility. Electricity was gone, and everything along with it. A world at a standstill, filled with people left in the dark. Had that idol I liked evacuated somewhere long ago? Or was she gone too? I stared at the eerie crystals proliferating everywhere, my heart sinking into a pit of pure despair. I forced myself to face the truth. This wasn't a dream. Countless crystals, feeding on electricity to grow, had brought the world to a complete end. A heavy rain began to fall over the ghost town, coldly lashing against the deserted streets. While I was tucked away in the mountains of Okutama, cutting myself off from the world and playing at being a killer, hiding away in my own little bubble, the brilliant light of human civilization had been silently and completely extinguished. All that remained for me was overwhelming loneliness and despair. I had barely managed to scrape by until now, but without electricity, my food stockpiles would eventually run dry, and starving to death would become a very real possibility. To survive, I knew I had to make a change. I began a life of hunting and gathering. I made my decision, but relying on knowledge from anime and books was a mistake. My amateur traps and makeshift fishing rods only showed me how harsh reality could be. Even my last resort, the home garden, ended up teaching me exactly how wild animals survive in the world. I suffered through their relentless, merciless looting of my crops. Driven by hunger and a growing sense of pride, I decided to go on the offensive. I would use my own power to turn the tables and make them my food. I gripped my magic staff, my only hope and my only comfort. I took aim at my prey, a massive deer standing in the brush. Using my magic, I successfully neutralized the deer and quickly drained its blood on the spot. I finished the field dressing and secured a massive haul of fresh meat. Since I didn't have a refrigerator to keep it in, I decided to preserve the meat by smoking it over a fire. But then, I noticed something strange about my usual drying rack. The fish that were supposed to be drying there had vanished without a trace. A thief. In this collapsed world, looting and pillaging had become the new normal. I cursed myself for letting my guard down so easily. Looking down at the footprints left behind, I realized that I wasn't the only one still left alive in the Okutama area. I felt a surge of pride that my own ethics hadn't fallen far enough to steal, even as my face twisted in rage. 2 months had passed since my survival life began, and my daily routine had finally stabilized. In the mornings, I would go out to fetch fresh water, gripping my magic staff as I gathered wild plants in the mountains. It seemed the other residents of Okudama had all fled toward Ome City in search of supplies. The persimmons left hanging everywhere were the only traces left of the people who used to live here. I kept a sharp eye out for any remnants of the looters, while maintaining my cautious lifestyle. Then one day, I went to check the traps I had set. I found a piece of prey I had never seen before caught in the trap. It was a strange rabbit, with a red jewel embedded right into its forehead. In just a few short months, this world had transformed into a fantasy, complete with magic stones and even magical creatures. I examined the body closely. The meat looked like a normal rabbit, and it seemed perfectly edible. Eating it shouldn't be a problem. But then there was the stone. I extracted the distorted, spherical red gem from its head. Even when I scratched it with an industrial diamond, it didn't leave a single mark. Mohs hardness level 11. Was this another one of those terrifying magic stones? If the Okuta meteorite, carved from the fallen star, wasn't the only special thing out there, then it meant more than one magic stone had rained down from the sky. And if that was the case, then what about that electric crystal that destroyed the Earth? My intuition told me this was another magic stone. The big cities were reduced to nothing but data now. So I decided to run an experiment with the electric crystal in my hand. But in its raw state, the crystal didn't emit any beams or vibrations. I realized a specific sound or frequency might be the key, or perhaps the shape itself was what mattered. I took a piece brought down by that rain of crystals, secured the small fragment into my machine tool, and carefully monitored the pressure of my fingers so it wouldn't shatter. Relying only on my touch, I began grinding it into a perfect sphere. Once I had processed it into a flawless globe, a brilliant light suddenly erupted from the electric crystal, illuminating the world. The energy source that ruined everything seemed to be an infinite supply. This was the raw material for a magic staff. I started calling myself the magic staff craftsman of the heavens. I danced with joy over my wild ambitions for Evan, but I soon hit the cruel reality that there were no buyers. 1 year has passed since the crystal disaster. The blessings of spring and autumn still remain, but everything else has changed. The brutal winter had finally come to an end. It was supposed to be the start of a festival, but my diary told a different story. Even my livestock and food supplies had been completely depleted, driven mad by hunger after a failed hibernation. I prepared for death the moment I crossed paths with a starving bear. The power of the octometeorite had completely run dry. If I made one wrong move, it was over. I could have lost my life at any second. After a full year of living in total isolation, my survival skills had reached a whole new level. My body had transformed as well, becoming lean and powerful, but the reality was still grim. Spring arrived after that grueling winter, and I stared at an empty rice bin, my food supplies totally gone. Standing before the third mountain, I looked back on my days of hunting and gathering. I clutched my head in the tall grass, sinking into deep despair. I headed toward a nearby abandoned power station. Thank you for watching. I could see a potential rice harvest ahead, but the question was whether I could stay alive until then. This is the ultimate power I have to pass down. I treat this staff, my partner, as a guardian deity. I enshrined it in my home, and it held an electric crystal. I kept encountering unknown magical creatures embedded with gems and ancient lore. I waited for the lightning to strike. The investors and people from the financial institutions. They watched the beasts that used their cries as a trigger to manipulate magic. I took the single red gem rabbit I had managed to kill, and upon inspection, I saw the stone had a strange double-layered structure. A stone the size of a small penny was putting out the calculated power of something 50 times its size. The secret to this abnormal power was that double-layered construction. I looked at the footage from the Sonoranda auto system. I cracked open an electric crystal, attempting a demonstration by embedding another sphere inside. I ran the experiment, but the result was a total failure. It turns out that once a magic stone is broken even a single time, it seems to lose its magical power completely. My plan to piece the fragments back together went up in smoke. I had to shift my perspective. I thought of the way people build ships and bottles. I drilled a tiny, precise hole into the crystal sphere. I mastered the specialized tools needed for the job. This wasn't just a simple fix. I carved out the entire interior through that tiny opening, working tirelessly, without a single mistake. I built the internal structure right inside the stone. Then, I sealed the gaps with resin. It was just like the rabbit's magic stone. I successfully replicated that massive power boost while improving the focus of the blast. I had finally discovered a path forward that was entirely my own. It was the culmination of all my craftsmanship. The Type 3 high-capacity magic staff. My resources were completely drained. I was running on empty. To survive and surpass the challenges ahead, I threw away my useless pride as a shut-in. Armed with my powerful new staff, I finally headed toward the dangerous city. I steeled my resolve to take that first step forward. I solidified my plans for what came next. I descended from the mountains into a silent, sprawling metropolis. I finally set foot inside the city limits. Had it turned into a complete ruin? Or was there a community of survivors? still holding on somewhere inside. Either way, the thought of running into people made my skin crawl. I was terrified of social interaction. I prayed I could finish my scavenge without crossing paths with a single soul. It took 3 hours to reach the neighboring city, but the sight that greeted me wasn't what I expected. It looked like a giant monster had gone on a rampage. The neighborhood was half destroyed, with rows of houses crushed into a miserable, gruesome mess. Since magic actually exists in this world, it wouldn't be strange if ferocious monsters existed too. Cold sweat rolled down my face as I stared at the carnage. If there are beasts out there capable of using magic, then a wild animal tearing through a house like paper is a terrifying reality. It would be easy enough to just blow past this place, but I chose this specific spot for a reason. The buildings here are relatively intact, and more importantly, I can't sense any human presence. There's no one here to hurt me. I decided whatever danger had been here was long gone, and headed toward an abandoned house that looked like a gold mine for supplies. The air inside the empty house was heavy and stagnant. The stench of decay and mold hit me hard. I had to be careful to avoid the rooms where the smell was worst. As I pushed deeper into the house, I found a box of unopened trading cards and tore it open. I grabbed canned goods, seasonings, and anything else that caught my eye. I even managed to find the latest volumes of a manga I used to read. I couldn't help but imagine the horrific tragedy that had struck this town, and it made me realize just how safe my life as a mountain shut-in really was. I moved on to another house with its door hanging wide open. There, lying right in the entryway, I spotted a single, handwritten note. It said everyone was evacuating to the medical center to seek protection. I reminded myself to stay sharp, even here in the Okutama Mountains. There was supposed to be a refugee camp in Ohm, but the lack of people was strange. Sensing the unsettling atmosphere, I decided to grab only the essentials and get out fast. I scavenged some seeds from my planters, watching them catch the light as I tucked them away. I glanced past a dusty goldfish bowl sitting in the shadows, and prepared to move on to the next house. But right then, I froze. In this melancholy, post-apocalyptic silence, a sound suddenly echoed through the air. A cold voice called out, and I spun around to see a mysterious girl in a black coat standing on a roof. She stood there against the backlight, her silhouette sharp and imposing. She looked down at me with a piercing, predatory gaze. Her eyes were locked onto mine. "Hey you, who gave you permission to scavenge in this area?" The pressure radiating from her was overwhelming. I looked at the weapon gripped in her hand, feeling the pure, raw killing intent she was projecting. I realized right then that I had just run into the worst possible person. She had the kind of refined beauty that belonged on the cover of a magazine. She looked like she was in high school. I felt like I'd seen her somewhere before. Her voice even sounded familiar, but I couldn't place it. As a former shut-in, I was notoriously bad at distinguishing the faces of real-life women. Reality is never as kind as 2D. I stood there frozen and speechless, cursing my luck instead of answering her interrogation. Suddenly, a surge of spiritual energy began to swirl around the girl's staff. The moment I saw that, my survival instincts kicked into overdrive. Every fiber of my being was screaming at me to run, but I knew I wouldn't get far. I surrender. There's no way I'm fighting a magic stone user. A terrifying battle like this was more than a shut-in like me could handle. Throwing my pride away, I immediately dropped my handmade staff to the ground. The girl leaped down from the roof and landed gracefully in front of me. I've always been terrified of other people, especially when they have an overbearing, superhuman attitude like hers. Watching her display that kind of physical prowess, my fear tripled in an instant. She looked down at me with a cold, ruthless gaze, and I prepared to beg for my life with a trembling voice. This was the start of a long, miserable day for a city boy like me. Facing the girl's murderous intent, I started shaking. I managed to stammer out that I wasn't affiliated with any group. I had come all the way to Okutama, walking along the tracks from where I parked my car. I had completely missed the warning signs, stating that all trespassers would be killed on sight. But the girl's sharp eyes were fixed on the handmade staff I'd just tossed away. She stared at the gremlin stone embedded in the wood, realizing that someone had processed it with incredibly high-level precision. She noticed the craftsmanship immediately. I begged her to take the staff and just let me go, desperate to escape this nightmare. She ignored my pleas entirely and raised her own staff high into the air. The air began to swirl, forming a freezing spear of massive magical power. The magic was unleashed. As the girl swung her arm down, the core of the spell focused into a single point, looking like a thin line of burning incense. Before it was fired directly at me, it tore through the air with a deafening roar. The ice spear grazed my cheek as I braced for death, hurtling toward a target behind me at blinding speed. The spear of ice slammed into the gray target, obliterating everything in its path. I stood there, frozen in terror, waiting for what came next. Then, a sound like the world splitting apart shook the very foundation of the earth. The thunderous echo rang through the mountains. A massive explosion of magical energy ripped through the building, sending debris flying as the destructive force carved a deep scar into the silent, apocalyptic town. The structure collapsed under the shockwave, turning bone white as it froze solid in an instant. Cold mist and ice crystals swirled through the air, and I found myself gasping for breath amidst the magical fallout. The girl who had unleashed it just stood there, cold and indifferent. I gasped at the unbelievable sight before my eyes. The girl's eyes were wide with a mixture of shock and confusion. Everything had been smashed into a million pieces. The remains of the house were impaled by a massive, jagged icicle. This level of destruction was completely off the charts. Witnessing this power in the middle of the city, I wanted to scream in a blend of pure terror and awe. This was the true power of high-level magic, far beyond anything I knew. Compared to the beams fired by my homemade staves, this was real magic on an entirely different dimension. I forgot my fear for a moment, my eyes sparkling like a child's. But the girl who had actually used the staff seemed to be the one most shaken by the result. The output was abnormal, and she broke into a cold sweat. She trembled at the sheer insanity of the unknown staff in her hand. The magical output was simply impossible. Seeing the result of her own power, the girl's expression grew even more hostile. She marched right up to me and violently grabbed me by the collar. She shoved the staff right into my face. She demanded to know exactly where I got it. I let out a pathetic scream as she interrogated me. Terrified, I immediately confessed that I was the one who made it. My own voice sounded foreign as it trembled in the air. The words, "I made it," hung between us. It was a fact that seemed impossible to believe. The girl kept her grip tight on my chest, her gaze piercing through me like a physical blade. I could only stare back into her cold eyes. Inside her head, she was rapidly calculating my true value. A scent drifted off her, the smell of sun-dried herbs and gunpowder. It was the scent of someone who had survived countless battles. She was a dangerous person, but she seemed to decide I wasn't a threat and finally let go. My social anxiety kicked in, and I was screaming inside for her to let me go home. The girl looked at me with a mix of exasperation and disbelief. She demanded a full explanation of how I broke into her territory. I stood there in the middle of the city, paralyzed by fear. I let tears of pure pathetic shame stream down my face. She dragged me along until we reached a private residence. As I stepped inside, the atmosphere shifted instantly. It was the makeshift base of the witch, reeking of dried herbs and gunpowder. She stood tall and declared that she was the one who controlled this entire area. The Witch of That was the name she gave me. I had no choice but to reveal my own identity as we began to trade information. We were both testing the waters, trying to see what the other knew. Up until now, I only knew about the beasts with gems embedded in their bodies. I thought they were the only threat in this world. But the witch spoke of dragons and ghosts, threats from a complete fantasy world. I had been a shut-in living peacefully in the deserted mountains of Okutama. I was completely lacking in common sense, so I timidly explained my situation. While I spoke of the silent, empty cities, she spoke of man-eating witches. She casually hinted at the horrors lurking just outside my door. I had been dragged out of my isolated island, and now I had to face the truth of this world. She poured me a cup of warm tea as I sat there trembling. Then, the girl began to explain the end of the world and the special nature of this broken reality. The lesson began in a heavy silence. She pointed to the switch that had devoured the electricity. Following the legends of old, she called these things gremlins. Last April, a terrifying meteor shower rained down countless mana stones onto Earth. Those mana stones are invisible to the naked eye. They scatter radioactive cesium and infest our machinery. That is how they form these gremlins. That is how they take control. This phenomenon spread across the globe, killing off the world's infrastructure in the blink of an eye. Then there were the animals that survived the infestation and adapted to the mana. They mutated into grotesque monsters, true demonic beasts. The police and the self-defense forces were useless. Faced with giant, magic-wielding creatures, modern weapons didn't stand a chance. Even the evacuation shelters were completely wiped out in the carnage. Hearing this, I felt the crushing weight of humanity's despair. The end was much closer than I ever imagined. But there was an exception. The girl standing before me was a witch who survived that living hell. Her true identity was something far beyond human. She had endured the gremlin infestation, and through a gauntlet of agonizing despair, she emerged as a transcendent with supernatural powers. Mana flowed through her veins like a second pulse, teetering on the razor's edge between life and death. In that moment, she was reborn as a witch. Hearing the sheer brutality of her past, I could only hold my breath in silence. With modern weaponry rendered useless, only those with supernatural abilities could fight back. She wasn't always alone, though. She once had her family, her father, and the support of her childhood friends. She was their beautiful witch, the one who used the fruits of to protect and lead them all. It sounded like a heroic tale from an anime, but was now a ghost town. Every single one of them was dead. I killed some of them myself. The words spilling from the girl's mouth were a blood-soaked account of a brutal purge. Back then, she was just a child. She had been forced to hunt monsters just to survive. As the tension hung heavy in the air, her sharp gaze shifted back to my magic staff. Nauseated by the weight of her interrogation, I began to speak with a trembling voice. I started explaining the staff's internal structure. I told her how I took a gremlin I found at the substation and carved it into a perfect sphere with my own 2 hands. I even used the leftover shavings as a finishing touch. I explained how I used them as an abrasive to polish the surface to a mirror shine. The witch looked stunned that this was pure handiwork, without any magical assistance. She couldn't believe I used basic tools like carving knives. To her, it was impossible to shave down such a material by hand. Even the elite survivors she knew, the top-tier engineers gathered by the Witch of the Eye, couldn't handle the gremlin's hide. Faced with the creature's abnormal hardness, not a single one of them had succeeded in processing it. She was convinced she had finally found a breakthrough. She interrogated me, certain I was hiding laser tech or some secret formula. But I didn't have any secrets to give. I insisted that this was nothing more than the result of my own manual skill. The girl didn't believe a word of it. I fixed my eyes on the magic stone embedded in her own staff. I offered to shave it down right then and there to prove my point. But that stone was a blood-soaked trophy from a murdered mage of Aruma. There was no way she'd just hand over something won through so much sacrifice. Her sudden, violent rage made me tremble down to my bones. I realized my mistake and immediately tried to take back the offer. I scrambled for an alternative and asked if she had any spare gremlin parts. I needed a different material to show her what I could do. I kept insisting that I could process anything by hand. Finally, she decided to put my claims to the test. She warned me that there was absolutely no escape. She gave me a sharp look and told me not to touch a single thing. With that, she disappeared into the back of the room. I was left standing there all alone. I took a moment to look around the space. The room was a mess of feminine touches and the stench of dried blood. Gunsmithing kits were scattered everywhere among her personal belongings. It was an unbalanced, twisted space. In an anime, the protagonist's heart would be racing from being in a girl's room. But with my extreme social anxiety, I just wanted to find a way to escape. I started planning a route for a desperate getaway. I scanned the room, looking for any possible exit. Then, my eyes locked onto one specific spot. My breath hitched in my throat. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. It was a legendary piece of official merchandise. Only 50 of these existed in the entire world. The limited edition music box from Magical Girl Logical Einstein was sitting right there. My inner otaku was reaching its absolute limit. The craftsmanship on the casing was breathtaking. I was mesmerized by the intricate details of the carvings. I reached out and turned the key to hear its melody. But something was wrong deep inside the mechanism. I heard the sickening sound of gears grinding against each other. The music box wouldn't spin at all. The fact that this ultra-rare, record-breaking masterpiece was broken filled me with irrational rage. If it's broken, get it fixed, damn it. I spat the words out in my head while my blood boiled. Without thinking, I grabbed the tools from her workbench. I worked with extreme caution to avoid leaving a single scratch. I took it apart piece by piece and inspected the internal mechanism. The gears had simply been knocked out of alignment by some kind of impact. Analyze, transfer, reconstruct. For a master craftsman like me, a repair of this level was child's play. I finished the repair perfectly. A cute, delicate melody began to echo through the room. I lost myself in the sound of that legendary masterpiece. But a second later, reality hit me like a truck. Don't touch a single thing in here. The witch's warning flashed through my mind. The color drained from my face as the door behind me creaked open. There she was, standing right in the doorway. I braced myself, fully expecting her to kill me right then and there. But contrary to my grim expectations, the cold, murderous intent had completely vanished from her face. Heian stood there frozen. As the gentle melody of the music box filled the air, she just stood in silence, enveloped by the sound. Her expression was that of someone witnessing an impossible miracle. It was just a song from some old anime, but for her, it carried a weight of emotion that was almost too much to bear. Large tears began to spill from her eyes as she thought of her late sister. She whispered her thanks, explaining that this was her sister's final memento. Meanwhile, my ultimate otaku brain was filled with greed, wondering if I could somehow convince her to give me this limited edition item. My sister died from an illness. Hearing the girl speak through her tears, I felt a sharp pang of guilt over my own shamelessness. I felt disgusted by my own selfish desires. In that moment, her entire attitude shifted toward the man who had repaired her precious treasure. Every ounce of hostility had vanished from her gaze. Her eyes were now filled with intense gratitude and a deep sense of debt. She insisted that she had to repay me for what I'd done. The girl suggested that I move with her to the big city. She offered me a place where I could live in safety. But there was one major problem. I am an extreme misanthrope. To a guy like me, moving to a populated area was nothing short of a living nightmare. I desperately refused, but she was determined to pay me back no matter what. So I told her, if you'll do anything, then just stay away from me. And please, don't even show me your face. It was my earnest plea, born from pure social anxiety. But to her, it must have sounded incredibly cruel. Seeing the hurt look on the girl's face, I panicked and started making excuses. I tried to explain that it wasn't that I hated her specifically. It's just that human interaction in general scares me to death. After nearly an hour of me desperately rambling, the girl finally reached for a paper bag and put it over her head. It was a bizarre sight, a girl standing there with a bag over her face. But at least the misunderstanding was cleared, and her human silhouette was hidden. With the bag over her head, I finally let out a long, deep breath and calmed down. Now that I had regained my composure, I decided to get down to business. It was time to show her how I actually process magic stones. I started by firing a weak, flickering beam from a raw stone. It was a pathetic display of power. Barely more than a flicker, like that screaming beaver meme she mentioned earlier. I ignored her commentary on my spellcasting and focused on the task at hand. I brushed off her reaction and immediately began the work of a master craftsman. I needed to carve the stone into a perfect sphere to prove how much the power would jump. I didn't even have a vise or any proper tools to hold it in place. Carving a magic stone no bigger than a grain of rice was a nerve-wracking, exhausting process. But if I have one saving grace, it's the dexterity of my hands. I pushed my focus to the limit, wielding my crude tools with precision for several minutes. Finally, I finished a sphere that I could honestly call a masterpiece. I hadn't even started the polishing stage yet. This was just the raw, carved shape of the sphere, and yet, the energy radiating from it was incomparable to before. A moment later, a high-output beam erupted from the stone, revealing the true, terrifying potential of my craft. I had just become the successor to a power that shouldn't exist. The girl's face went pale as she realized the gravity of what I'd done. She warned me that if this god-tier skill ever went public, every transcendent in Japan would hunt me down. It was like being the only person capable of building a machine gun in a world of bows and arrows. She told me that to the powerful, I was nothing more than a prize to be kidnapped. The thought of being targeted sent a cold shiver straight through my gut. I felt the weight of the danger pressing down on me. But deep down, my inner geek was buzzing with a secret, dark excitement at the thought of changing the world. I had always wanted a stage to show off my work, far beyond any online auction site. But walking through a ruined society to sell my own products? For a guy like me with crippling social anxiety, that kind of face-to-face hustle was physically impossible. As I started packing up my things to head home, the girl seemed to have taken a real liking to me. She offered to help me out, but all I wanted was to get away from her and go back to my room. I told myself I would never see her again after today. I planned to keep things exactly the way they were before. I would return to my life as a lonely, isolated shut-in. In my mind, that was the only way to stay safe. That was my ultimate survival strategy, or so I thought. My masterpieces would never be seen by anyone, and my monotonous, unchanging days would just drag on. This realization left a bitter, lingering regret deep inside my heart as a craftsman. She was so deeply grateful for the music box repair that she treated the item like a sacred treasure. If I could just overcome this crippling social anxiety, maybe this blue, which would be the one to accept me. If I used this strange debt she owed me to my advantage, I might actually get her to listen to the one big favor I had in mind. As we walked through the overgrown ruins of the city, a game-changing proposal flashed through my mind. I looked at her and asked, "Will you be the sales agent for my magic staves?" It was the same business model as a home delivery service. The logic was exactly the same. I wouldn't have to meet a single soul, staying perfectly safe while she handled the public. I could stay a shut-in deep in the mountains while turning my hobby into a real business. It was a perfect plan to balance my safety and my craft. The witch would collect my finished magic staves and sell them while keeping my true identity a total secret. She would use the profits to procure rare materials and deliver them from the major cities right to my doorstep. I'd be pushing all the tedious, annoying chores onto her. And in exchange, I'd keep maintaining her staff for free. Our interests were perfectly aligned. Right then and there, the two of us formed a secret contract. She was a young girl destined to become a hero, fighting on the front lines for everyone to see. Having her wield a staff I created with my own hands would be the absolute best advertisement I could ever ask for. Even if I had to keep my identity hidden, I couldn't suppress the urge to show off. I wanted the entire world to know just how incredible my creations really were. To satisfy both my craftsman's pride and my own greed, I swore to create a masterpiece worthy of her. I looked down at the palm-sized stone the girl had left with me. It was a blue magic stone from an eyes, a rarity beyond compare. With a gem of this size, I could reach heights no one has ever seen. I could even build a structure with over 70 layers of magic. My spirit was soaring as I prepared to start the work. But as I reached for my tools, reality hit me hard. I hadn't eaten a single thing all day, and my body was screaming. My hands were shaking, and my vision was starting to blur. I dragged myself to the front door and pulled it open. And there it was, a small miracle. Fresh lettuce, salted rice balls, and a stack of canned goods had been left right there on my doorstep. It was a delivery from the witch herself. Without a second thought, I tore into the food, rejoicing as the energy returned to my limbs. I felt like I could take on the world again. The great city that had once satisfied my every need was back, right here in my own home. Even if I realized I was missing a specialized tool, I knew it would arrive by the very next day if I asked. That was the reality of my new life. A dreamlike, exclusive delivery service had officially begun to function. It was a total lifesaver. I began developing entirely new construction methods, and with every specialized tool I needed arriving at my door, my work efficiency skyrocketed. Then, after 7 days of grueling, precision labor, the massive project was finally complete, and I wrapped the finished staff in paper. I felt the deep satisfaction of a true craftsman as I placed it gently on the doorstep. It was a masterpiece that embodied the meaning of blue, engraved with the very life of the Juanos. A peerless weapon, unlike anything else in existence. I had given it my all. The next morning, along with the instruction manual, the staff had been picked up and taken away. I started imagining the hand that would swing it, picturing the day which would take the city by storm. I let a proud smile spread across my face, the smile of the world's greatest staff maker. Her name is Hayori Aoyama. Back in the peaceful era, she lived a life of family warmth. She would say goodnight to the people she loved. She cherished those moments. But the world collapsed, and everyone she loved died. Now, she faces the cold reality that they are gone forever. In the middle of this ruin, she stands completely alone. As a solitary witch, she continues to protect this city by herself. But now, she has a weapon made by a craftsman with freakish skill, and a crippling case of social anxiety. The ultimate staff. By securing an exclusive contract with the Blue Witch of Sendai, Kianos, the distribution of this ultimate weapon was practically the same as gaining total control over the region. With this power, she felt a quiet certainty that she could protect Ohm, the wreckage of her memories. Just as my benefactor requested, I began carefully selecting exactly who I would sell my handmade magic staves to. I could use them to strengthen ties with friendly factions through secret deals. And for my enemies, I would demand they prepare for their end. I held the staff I had poured my soul into, refusing to let it go. This was the spark that would redraw the entire map of the world. Knowing my work was becoming a legendary item gave me a deep sense of craftsman's pride. Meanwhile, back in the city, the Blue Witch was already on the move. Thanks for watching. In the heat of battle, the gremlins were all small fry to the Blue Witch. Kianos unleashed a massive blast of magic from her staff. These weaklings weren't even enough to test its true power. The destruction was absolute. The output was so overwhelming that she lost control, leveling the surrounding houses in an instant. She found herself wishing for a target worthy of a real test drive. And just as she was grumbling to herself, an unexpected visitor arrived. Something tapped against the window. It was a familiar of the Eyeball Witch, a grotesque, one-eyed bat. She thought it was just here for idle gossip, but the familiar's frantic state signaled a dire emergency. A massive monster has appeared in Tokyo Bay. The creature made landfall with overwhelming force. Now, the entire coastline is a sea of fire. The elite forces stationed there were wiped out. Even the powerful vampire witch was killed in action. The other witches didn't even fight. They just turned and fled. Hearing the news, Kianos felt the threat closing in on Ohm. She coldly declared she would stay and finish it, refusing to abandon her territory. She remembered the time she left out of the kindness of her heart. While she was away on a hunt, her home was left completely defenseless. She had failed to protect what mattered. Every single person she cared for was abducted and taken away. That loss still haunts her to this day. It was this trauma that kept her chained to this land. If the enemy is coming here, I'll hunt it down alone, she thought as she leaped into the fray. I landed on the battlefield and looked up at the sky. What I saw there stopped my heart. The scale of the creature was beyond anything I had imagined. A giant beast was trampling the city, rising through a thick shroud of black smoke. This thing was on a different level than any gremlin I had ever fought. Compared to the monsters I knew, this creature possessed an overwhelming presence of pure mass and absolute despair. It was a true great kaiju. The beast loomed over the ruins, gripping a radio tower like a makeshift club. The giant beast stared down with eyes that seemed to mock our very existence. At its feet, I saw the other witches, unleashing every flame and spell they had in their arsenal. They were fighting desperately, pouring their lives into every strike. But their attacks didn't leave a single scratch. We were facing an incarnation of violence from a different dimension. Even as a veteran Blue Witch, I felt a wave of intense vertigo and terror wash over me. I used to believe that as long as we had transcendent protectors, humanity would never truly fall. But that conviction I held so dearly was now crumbling away with a deafening roar. I tightened my grip on my weapon, preparing to channel even the most ancient of my magic. I might just be a manufactured tool, but I can't run away when this kaiju is heading straight for Ohm. That city is the place she is risking her life to protect. And in her hands, she holds that letter. The ultimate magic created by that genius craftsman cannot be left to go to waste. I set my sights on Genajira, preparing my maximum output wide-range freezing spell. I poured every drop of mana I had into my smartphone, but I hadn't even filled half of its capacity before the mana backflow threatened to tear away my control. It took everything I had just to keep my aim locked on the kaiju. My entire body began to creak and groan under the pressure. As I endured the crushing load, a sharp, fighting spirit reignited within my eyes. I'm going to make you pay for this. In the middle of this hopeless battle, a certain face flashed through my mind. It was that aloof, shut-in star, the face of the only magic staff craftsman left in the world. To prove the worth of his skill, I unleashed mana far beyond my limits. Sink into the glacier. Sleep forever in the eternal frost. From the girl's throat, the ultimate, divine incantation spilled out. I unleashed the spell through the staff, Sinos. The cryogenic mana surged forward, swallowing the raging kaiju whole. It sealed the beast inside a massive crystal of ice, a strike worthy of a god. The monster that had spread nothing but despair. This incarnation of pure tyranny let out one final, agonizing roar. The absolute zero magic froze the very air, eroding the giant's flesh and turning its massive weight into a silver ice statue. But the price for this miracle was far too high. The output was excessive. I thought, who told me to go this far? The town's industry lay frozen and broken. The people who had been running for their lives filled the air with screams as the kaiju fell. I had defeated the monster, but the blast radius leveled every home in the area. To be continued. I'm the monster that's going to destroy the world. Looking down at the town submerged in black silver, the girl spoke with a voice drained of all strength. The magic staff, Cyanos, which I, the genius craftsman, had forged, possessed a level of performance that was far too dangerous for a single witch to handle. It was a true product of over-technology. The release of mana had surged past its limits, draining every last drop of her power. The show was over, and her energy was completely spent. The girl let out a faint smile, whispering that she was out of mana. As the snow fluttered down, her consciousness faded, and she collapsed like she was dancing in the air. The scene shifts to Okudama in the heat of summer. I was brushing my teeth when I saw it. A massive structure towering in the distance. I couldn't believe my eyes as I stared at that giant monument of ice. I turned around and realized she was already there. The Blue Witch, wearing her mask and sitting quietly. My heart nearly leaped out of my chest. I thought, maybe it's because of that mask, but give me a heads up when you arrive. I didn't even sense her presence for a second. Otoshi was there, standing right in front of me. I felt a wave of relief, but I wished she'd just speak to me normally instead of being so intense. I told her flat out, no eating or drinking in here. The Ice Queen looked like she was already getting bored with my rules. Despite her attitude, the girl gave me a quiet, honest nod. Then, I asked her about that massive block of ice looming in the distance. It was a giant monster that had emerged from Tokyo Bay. The Blue Witch had stepped in to stop it. She had completely encased the beast in solid ice. But there was a catch to her victory. In the process, she had frozen an entire district of the city center. The sheer efficiency and scale of that magic was terrifying. And the worst part? This ice wasn't ever going to melt. I looked at her and thought, she's actually kind of cute when she's acting tough. As I gave her a small smile, her expression suddenly turned grave. She dropped a bombshell. The existence of my magic staff had been leaked. She looked me in the eye and said, "You've become the next Oppenheimer." I had created something on the level of a nuclear weapon. The secret of the staff's origin was finally out. I tried my best to keep the truth hidden from the Cotton Witches. I had been clinging to my sanity this whole time. Otoshi lamented that we had missed our golden opportunity. She lectured me, saying if my tech fell into terrorist hands, it would trigger World War III. I broke down in tears, telling her I just wanted to create something great. The thought of my work being used for a massacre was unbearable, but I knew exactly what kind of person I was. I wanted my work out in the world, but only if it was used by the right people. I begged her to find someone trustworthy for me. I looked at her with pleading eyes, hoping she'd understand. She refused, saying she was no judge of character, but I insisted she was better than a shut-in like me. She had been betrayed by her family and her childhood friends in the past. This girl was carrying the heavy trauma of a double betrayal. She took the responsibility of selling my work very seriously. But as a master craftsman with a social phobia, I had finally developed the ability to see people for who they really were. If a tragedy happened after the sale, I decided I could live with that. I dumped the entire responsibility onto her shoulders without a second thought. She let out a long, heavy sigh at my sheer lack of accountability. And so, the heated debate over selling the staff continued. The girl still hadn't shown up. I averted my eyes from her and decided to bring up the other matter I needed to discuss. She looked at me with an apologetic expression. She hesitantly held out an object for me to see. It was the masterpiece I had poured my heart and soul into creating. The Blue Witch Cyanos, now brutally snapped in half. She had boosted her maximum output freezing magic well beyond its physical limits before releasing it. As a direct result of that strain, the staff couldn't withstand the recoil and shattered. The wood was split open in a gruesome way. I looked closely at the damage. I confirmed that the magic stone core was still intact. Then, I switched into my craftsman's mindset to analyze the cause, realizing it was a phenomenon known as frost cracking. The moisture inside the staff had frozen and expanded rapidly. It's a rare occurrence where the wood literally bursts from the cold. This was the destructive power of sub-zero magic. That was the true reason behind the staff's total failure. I had identified the cause of the failure. I accepted the repair request right then and there. While she waited for me to finish, she told me she was going to wipe out the monsters in Okudama. Without a weapon and completely empty-handed, the girl leaped lightly into the air. I couldn't let her outshine me like that. I refused to lose to the confidence she showed by flying off unarmed. As an adult and a professional, I felt my craftsman's soul catch fire. I had to prevent the moisture from freezing again. I needed to stop the expansion from destroying the wood from the inside. Next time on the journey of a god-tier craftsman, I selected a specialized coating and carved out a new handle with godlike precision. I applied a layer of quick-drying varnish to the surface. I finished the exterior with a treatment to seal out every drop of moisture. I kept the basic design the same, but swapped the materials. I reinforced every single component to its absolute limit. The Blue Witch Cyanos version 2 was finally complete. I marveled at how fast I had finished such high-quality work. But just as I was praising my own perfection, the door swung open. I stared in shock at the girl who had already returned from her hunt. She scattered them all over the floor. In just 1 hour, She had completely wiped out the monsters in the depths of Okudama. The floor was covered in their magic stones. Her hunting speed and strategy were nothing short of monstrous. I tried to hide my shock as I handed over the finished product. The moment she saw the rebuilt staff, she froze, speechless at my insane speed and precision. I gave her a smug look and told her I was just naturally good with my hands, leaving the great city behind. The girl took to the skies once again. I realized I had never actually seen how the witch fights. I didn't know her style at all. If I could just get some feedback from the front lines, I might find even more ways to improve my work. My endless curiosity caught fire as I obsessed over creating the ultimate magic staff. 3 months have passed since the great kaiju incident. Thanks to the Blue Witch's absolute dominance, the population of the city has exploded, and my life as a shut-in has never been more comfortable. Everything was finally stable. I was living off the remnants of the old civilization. These preserved food legacies were still edible for now. Lately, I've even mastered a unique survival technique using magic beams on the riverbanks. I can stun fish instantly to keep my pantry stocked. In this world, everyone possesses at least a faint trace of magic. It's become a biological necessity to survive this ecosystem. The stronger the heavenly dragon's influence, the more power one gains. But it comes with the risk of mana crystallizing inside the body. That crystallization eventually tears your physical form apart from the inside out. But because my magic is so mediocre, I managed to escape that mutation entirely. While performing her routine maintenance, I asked the witch to clear out the monsters in the wasabi fields. A simple monster extermination quest. I asked if I could come along to observe her in action. The Blue Witch gave me a casual shrug and agreed. But she gave me one cold warning. You're responsible for your own life, so protect yourself. To me, she wasn't just a powerful ally. She was like a high-powered air conditioner that kept me cool in the summer heat. We stepped into the mountains together to reclaim the now-rare wild wasabi habitat. The moment we arrived at the site, even so, there wasn't a single monster in sight. The area felt as empty as a ghost town. But things were about to get troublesome. The guardians of this place were hidden, armed with sturdy shells and deadly stingers. History has shown how dangerous these creatures can be, but they couldn't hide from the masked witch's eyes. Up there, in the trees, she said, her sharp gaze piercing the invisible threat. Very well, I thought. It was time for her to show me what she could do. I wanted to see the power that had supposedly leveled the world in a single blow. I was about to witness her overwhelming magical combat firsthand. My heart pounded against my ribs with pure anticipation. As I watched with bated breath, she moved with fluid grace. She leaped into the air with a motion so elegant it felt weightless. Her grand, sweeping movements were the mark of a true master. It was pure artistry on the battlefield. I braced myself for a massive explosion of magical energy. But the grand spectacle I expected never came. The battle was over in a single, silent heartbeat. I was hoping to use her combat style as a reference, but it was too fast to even follow. As I grumbled about her speed, she turned to me with a suggestion. She offered to teach me a brand new spell, but I had a different idea. Lacking any social grace, I told her to summarize the theory in a 3-page report instead. We quickly made our way back down the mountain together. Once we reached the backyard, the masked witch took her place as my teacher. And so, our special post-battle magic lesson officially began. She started by teaching me the absolute basics of the basics. The spell was Aura, a freezing incantation with a very subtle pronunciation. The nuance of the sound was incredibly difficult to grasp. As I struggled with the tone, she patiently repeated it over and over again. The girl demonstrated the sound herself until I could finally distinguish it by ear. She began explaining the vital importance of memorizing these patterns. To me, it felt less like a simple spell and more like a lesson in history. It seemed like a complex, structured language of its own. I realized that magic wasn't just raw power, it was a science. According to the scholars of this world, there is a hidden logic to it all. A clear grammar and context govern every single cast. Only the transcendent ones truly understand the depth of these rules. Immediately, after waking from the coma caused by their mutation, they recall how to use magic as easily as remembering how to ride a bike. They say they naturally understand the magical language that suits them best, as if remembering a dream. People assume monsters are simply born knowing how to use magic, but she told me the truth was actually the exact opposite. Humanity took the natural cries and sounds of monsters and systematically organized them into a formal linguistic structure. That was the theory Maria, the transcendent, explained to me. She can control magical energy, but she cannot possess it herself. Those without power act as proxies, sparking wars near the magic stones. If you pronounce the words too accurately, you risk triggering a magical explosion by mistake. Imagine the danger in everyday conversation, the constant fear that a simple slip of the tongue during a phone call could set off a spell. It's a terrifying thought that would make any major city tremble. However, the spells used by the magic department are different. They require specific pronunciations that only a transcendent's mutated throat can produce. There are 7 of these silent tones, so I didn't need to worry about accidental casts. To demonstrate, she spun a complex incantation that instantly turned a nearby tree into a pillar of ice. I looked at her in awe, then thought about my own situation. I wondered if my voice, which sounds like a frantic, squealing beaver, actually held some kind of deep, linguistic meaning in the world of magic. I, Cyan, couldn't help but feel a bit skeptical about the whole thing. She admitted it herself. Most of her knowledge was just passed down from other experts. She bid me goodnight and prepared to leave. She didn't know the finer details, but this unknown phenomenon was different. My craftsman's soul, forged in the post-war systems of the big city, was quietly stirred. I felt that intense, intellectual curiosity only a city dweller can understand. After we finished watching the movie, she brought up the next Witch's Sabbath, scheduled for 5 days from now. She thanked me for my time and for hosting her. She promised to bring back detailed research materials from the scholars. There was no doubt her deep knowledge of magical tools would be invaluable. I smiled, already feeling the inspiration for my next-gen magic staff and counting down the days until we met again. The Tokyo Witches' Sabbath. It was a gathering of the witches who controlled the very heart of Japan. The Blue Witch, however, was participating remotely. She was logged in via her laptop. It used to be a casual gathering, but Connie, the talented vampire mage, changed that. She could sense the city of Tokyo as if it were divided into distinct sectors. A system was established to clarify status and prevent power concentration, greatly improving Tokyo's overall security. It handled everything from backup requests during monster raids to emergency supply orders. They handled the exchange of relief supplies and the distribution of refugees. All sorts of political decisions were made at these gatherings. They had even suppressed threats from the sky. But after the absolute power of the vampire mage was gone, attendance plummeted. The Blue Witch had no interest in playing politics. She just wanted to finish her business and leave. Marisha, are you there? Today, the witches ignored every other agenda item and focused on a single mage. I watched through the screen as the person she called out appeared. It was a man in a suit, drenched in a cold sweat and looking completely exhausted. He was a mage with the elemental power to see into the future. The Blue Witch hit him with a sharp, piercing question. After a heavy silence, he finally opened his mouth and said, "I'm sorry, but..." He couldn't give her the answer she wanted. Was she going to kill him for failing her? The Blue Witch was terrifying, but Marisha was currently under her protection. She demanded that he hand over the research materials regarding that specific language. "Hand them over now," she ordered. The magic in those documents was supposed to be incomplete. What on earth did she plan to do with that research? A flash of suspicion lit up the girl's eyes, doubting that her motives were purely for study. The sound of the copier whirring to life filled the room. In this dying world where resources are scarce, lending out one of only 1,000 research documents is no small favor. The man hesitated, clearly wondering what she was really after. He told her that if she wanted them, she'd have to offer something as collateral. The girl countered by offering enough food for 1,000 people, a full week's worth of supplies, and a steady supply of clean water. But the man dismissed her offer entirely and had the audacity to demand her strongest weapon, the magic staff, Cyanos, in exchange. He had been after Cyanos from the very beginning. Faced with such a transparent, greedy demand, a cold, sharp anger began to bleed into the girl's expression. She mocked him, asking if his precious future sight had failed to show him what was about to happen to him right now. Despite her sarcasm, the man didn't flinch. His face remained grim. He slowly opened his heavy mouth to speak, revealing a vision of a cruel future where a massive famine strikes in 2 years. The words falling from the man's lips painted a reality so horrific I wanted to look away, starting with the total halt of imports, the coming silence, the exhaustion of chemical fertilizers, and the roads torn to pieces by the chaos. Worse, the elderly who actually knew how to farm were wiped out by the infrastructure collapse and the monster threat. The survivors are trying to reform agriculture, but at this rate, they'll never make it in time. Every fishing boat has been smashed to splinters. The fisheries are gone, and the farmland has been turned into breeding grounds for beasts. Even the people in these images, who finally learned to kill monsters, will find that by the time they win, the precious food is already sitting in the stomachs of those creatures. The world's leading production companies have collapsed, and the death toll is climbing. The high-yield crop varieties are lost forever. The man spoke with a regret so thick it felt like he was spitting blood, cursing the time wasted protecting useless monuments like the National Diet Building. He said we should have been protecting the food producers instead. 80% of Tokyo's population is facing starvation as food production plummets. It wasn't just a shortage, it was total, absolute despair. He looked at us, as if inviting us to swallow that bitter reality. The girl's face paled as her previous confidence crumbled into shame. I realized we had been celebrating saving Tokyo from monsters while ignoring the famine that would finish us off. Everything we did was just delaying the inevitable, and now he was begging for the power of her staff. We only have 2 years of grace left. This man had paid an insane price to the Flower Witch, obtaining both her kitchen knife and the secret techniques of her craft. All that was left was the pursuit of a powerful magic source. With her staff, he could amplify that agricultural magic to its absolute limit, spreading it across the land to trigger an explosion in food production. He was desperate to change a future where 3 million people around Tokyo starved to death. But looking at the girl, I knew she only cared about her sister and her own small circle. She would do anything for her family. but she felt no obligation whatsoever to save 3 million complete strangers. The man swore on his life that he would return the staff, but the girl just stared back and hit him with a cold, hard fact. She reminded him of the last time someone lent out a sacred artifact. They had offered their strength to help others, only to be betrayed and slaughtered in the end. They were murdered for their kindness. Someone went and set the worst possible precedent for us, didn't they? The man's face twisted in pure despair as he realized the weight of her words. But Keanu's didn't just create things out of thin air. She wasn't just some mindless tool being used by others. She dropped a subtle hint about the person who actually crafted the staff. Looking at the girl, the man saw a tiny, flickering spark of hope. She set a condition. Instead of just handing over research papers, she would send the researcher himself. She decided she would find a way to solve the food crisis on her own terms. She proposed a bold compromise while refusing to let go of that ultimate staff. I watched as she skillfully seized total control of the negotiation. The man begged her to tell him if they would all be safe by next month. Oh, is that so? I thought, looking at the exhausted man standing there. He stared into the void and began quietly chanting an unknown spell. The words spilled from his lips like a rhythmic prayer. He was trying to see the path ahead if he accepted this compromise. He was looking for a glimpse into the future. It was a spell designed to read the consequences of a single choice. He was shaving away his own life force to fuel the magic. Relying on a power that could rewrite history, he prepared to make a choice for all of humanity. So what did you see? The girl asked him coldly. The man just gave a dazed, empty smile and whispered, I think it's going to be okay. He whispered those words, and just like that, the negotiation was settled. But there was a heavy price for peering into that harsh future. Something was clearly wrong with the man. He was acting like a toddler. He laughed and said, I'm doing great, while the girl watched in confusion. It was a mana backflow caused by overusing his future sight magic. The man had regressed into a child, and the other witches stepped in. They gently soothed him and led him away toward the break room. The girl watched that pathetic scene unfold with a cold, distant gaze. Since a peaceful deal had finally been reached, she dismissed the familiar. They tried to pressure her into returning to the monthly assemblies, but she gave a quiet, firm refusal, making it clear she was done with them. She cut the connection, leaving the room in a heavy, deep silence. Left alone, the girl began to think things through. The food crisis was a massive threat to all of humanity, but a small, certain light of hope was flickering in her heart. If she consulted with that genius craftsman, Cyan, the one with the crippling social anxiety, he would surely find a way to fix it with his world-altering power. After all, he was the bottomless mystery who had created that smartphone. And then, the promised 5 days finally passed. I looked at the circle on my calendar and took a deep breath. Mr. Otto attempted to visit the Blue Witch. I had been waiting for those unknown magical strings. Just hearing their resonance set my inquisitive mind on fire. This was magic that surpassed even my greatest masterpiece. I needed to unravel the structural theory behind these chords. Mastering them was essential, and my passion as a craftsman burned in my chest. But the witch who arrived brought along a creature wearing a bow tie. It was such a cute little girl, or so I thought. Nice to meet you. I am Ohinata Satoshi, it said. The beast was speaking fluent Japanese. I was shocked by this new encounter with a magical creature. But as for Satoshi's true identity, he was apparently a former human and a scholar of magical origins. As I shook his front paw, I was completely captivated by his cuteness. Despite my joy, a strong sense of doubt began to swirl in my mind. It was eating at me. What I had requested were paper documents and research materials. I didn't ask for a talking small animal. I whispered to the witch, asking if this was some kind of delivery error. But she didn't seem to care at all. The witch told me she was originally from Ohm, a girl who survived her parents' divorce only to face a bizarre twist of fate. A magical accident had transformed her into this adorable, small creature. Looking at Satoshi's overwhelming cuteness, my crippling social anxiety completely vanished. The fear retreated deep into the shadows, leaving me totally head over heels for the little thing. I asked if she was the witch's familiar, but she politely introduced herself as a magical linguist and began our long-awaited lecture. Trembling with a different kind of intensity, I looked for the research materials. Just give me the papers. I hissed at the witch in a low voice. I was supposed to receive physical documents, but the shock of this magical staff situation changed everything. My roommate had taken an interest in her, and that was the only reason she was brought here. I scratched my head, frustrated by the sheer absurdity of the situation. I needed to keep my own true identity hidden away in the mountains of Okudama, a living national treasure of Urker Sawari. That was the title she was parading around, and I was ready to protest with every fiber of my being. I told her 1,000 times to keep my existence a secret, but the person responsible for my protection decided that just because someone was from Ohm, they were trustworthy enough to leak my entire life story to. I felt a deep sense of despair at how soft she was being with our new guest. Then again, I was the one who dumped all the negotiations on her. She knew exactly what she was doing. I tried to brush off the frustration as best I could, since she wasn't a human I had to deal with, but a talking Ermin. Even someone with my level of social anxiety could manage a conversation. But the way the professor greeted me, her voice, her gestures, it all felt far too young. She gave me a bright, innocent smile and told me her actual age. I froze in place, thinking, she's nothing but a literal child. The Witch of the Azure Reach headed off to the study to kill time reading manga. Meanwhile, I led the cute little professor toward my personal workshop and opened the door. As we stepped inside, the tiny professor's eyes began to sparkle with pure wonder. She let out a cheer of genuine excitement at the sight. Rows of specialized tools and equipment lined the walls. Rare materials were organized with absolute precision. The space was the ultimate realization of a master magic craftsman's atelier. Seeing my sanctuary, praised so innocently by her, made my social anxiety melt away for a moment. A soft, proud smile actually managed to find its way onto my face. Her gaze then landed on a strange, hand-cranked device. Sitting in the corner, a makeshift centrifugal separator. I had built it using parts from a discarded golem. It was a piece of custom equipment, designed to test if I could isolate specific magical components, and it was covered in the marks of my various experiments. Even though the experiment ended in total failure, the little professor was deeply impressed by the intellectual curiosity behind it. She started asking if I used chemical etching, or if the precision came from the high quality of the non-woven fibers. She looked at all my failed prototypes, the ones that never saw the light of day, and called me a genius with pure, innocent admiration. I felt a wave of embarrassment wash over me. I tried to look away, but Hikari kept closing the distance between us. As someone who loves solitude, I usually keep my invisible walls high, but she was tearing them down without even trying. I told her how the knowledge my father left me was finally being put to good use in my research. I mentioned how people with formal university degrees often overlooked the simple, local techniques I relied on. She started bombarding me with questions about my private life, stepping right over the boundaries I usually set for others. Normally, I would have been on high alert, bracing myself against such a personal intrusion, but I realized I saw her as a fellow seeker of magical truth. Her pure desire to be friends sent my mind into a total tailspin. I want to be your friend. She was speaking Japanese, but I couldn't process the words. My brain flat out refused to understand what she meant. Friendship isn't something you force into existence. It's supposed to be a natural progression, isn't it? At least, that's what I assumed, having never actually had one. A storm of panic and stubborn self-defense raged inside me. I'm a man who gets tongue-tied just being invited to karaoke. I'm the last person anyone should be choosing as a friend. I gave her a blunt, cold rejection right then and there. The little professor's shoulders slumped in disappointment. Sorry to keep you waiting. She quickly pulled herself together despite the awkward tension. She was ready to start the rescue mission. But first, she began a special 10-minute lecture on magic language. I never thought I'd be sitting through a lecture again after graduation. I watched her closely as she spoke. Even though I had just pushed her away, Hikari was still treating me like a true equal. She looked like nothing more than an adorable little professor. No adult would have ever imagined the weight of her words. It had been years since she first took up this mantle. She explained how her father, an authority on Genbu studies, was a vampire. She began recounting the origins of magical linguistics, born from a research team requested by a wizard. The very first step for that research team was to interview witches and wizards to hear their actual incantations. Their goal was to collect as many linguistic samples as possible. Observation, inference, and hypothesis, verification, and consideration, the pillars of any academic field. Following the absolute laws of experimental science and utilizing the 5-step scientific method, her father collected 72 spells and challenged the unknown through analysis. He classified the meanings, concepts, and pronunciations of every spell gathered. But as a result of that first volume of research, a cruel, undeniable truth began to rise to the surface. The core of the magical language was something the physical structure of a Homo sapien could never actually pronounce. The language contained at least 7 distinct sounds that humans simply cannot produce. It was undeniable proof that this language was never intended for mankind to use. If you know a language, you can understand the environment that birthed it. Understanding that context is the key to unlocking the language itself. A snowy country like Japan has a rich vocabulary for describing snow. In Mongolia, they have countless specific names for horses. Language reflects the very essence of the people who speak it. It is a profound academic field that encompasses every element of a culture, and that includes the biological traits of the speakers themselves. Native speakers. To create magic that mimics the power of a native speaker, one would need to conduct their own exhaustive investigation. But the research she was describing was so advanced and required such immense patience. I found myself wondering if any normal adult could even hope to replicate it. I felt a sudden, heavy weight behind her words. I started to doubt her age all over again. She was like a book that had reigned at the top of a private academy for years. In this world on the brink of collapse, you aren't even allowed to survive unless you're exceptional. Sacred treasures must have their own written language too. But currently, I have no way of deciphering it. On top of that, there was something else in the Stone River that possessed a unique kind of magical power. If you mispronounced even a single syllable, you risked the magic exploding right in your face. Because of that danger, the research was always conducted at a secret, underground base. The research team had set themselves a massive goal, refining the incantations themselves. By sacrificing a small amount of blood and mana, they were developing a spell to cool down the body's limits, while aggressively boosting physical performance. I wondered what would happen if we actually perfected this. Even an ordinary person could stand a chance against weak monsters, and it would lighten the burden placed on the witches during combat. But the hopes of the major cities were ruthlessly crushed by a physical wall, the unpronounceable sounds. They had to avoid the sounds humans couldn't make, and find human words with the exact same meaning. To reconstruct the incantations through a bypass method, the sheer power and depth of linguistics required for this left me feeling completely awestruck. After I took the documents, she spoke quietly, explaining with a cold, detached tone how a magical explosion during the research had killed the entire team, including her father, leaving her to carry on the work alone.